For more than 1,000 years, in the mountains of Japan, there lived a cow that nobody was allowed to eat. You couldn't grill it. You couldn't roast it. Eating it was, for centuries, effectively against the law. These animals weren't food. They were machines, living tractors, bred to drag plows through flooded rice paddies and haul carts up mountain trails. They worked until they died, and then they were buried, not butchered. Today, a single steak from that exact same bloodline sells for over $200. A whole animal can go for tens of thousands of dollars. Restaurants shave it paper thin and serve it like treasure. It's called Wagyu, and it's the most expensive beef on earth. But here's the strange part. The very thing that makes Wagyu worth a fortune today, that soft, snowflake-like marbling of fat running through every bite, was never designed. Nobody bred it on purpose. It was an accident, a side effect of forcing these animals to work for 1,000 years. And the story of how a banned farm animal became a global luxury involves a religious law, an emperor who broke a taboo on live television of its era, and a genetic secret Japan tried to lock inside its borders forever. Let's go back to the beginning. Cattle first arrived in Japan around the 2nd century, brought over from the Asian mainland alongside rice farming. And from the very start, they had one job: work. These weren't the big, beefy animals you picture on a Western ranch. Early Japanese cattle were small, horned and tough. They plowed fields. They hauled timber for forestry and mining. They pulled carts carrying nobles and goods through rugged mountain terrain. For the people who owned them, a cow was one of the most valuable things you could possess. Not because of its meat, but because of its muscle. A strong ox could mean the difference between a harvest and starvation. And then, in the 6th and 7th centuries, something happened that would shape Wagyu for the next 1,200 years. Buddhism spread across Japan, and with it came a religious prohibition against eating the flesh of four-legged animals. Emperors issued decrees banning meat consumption. Cattle, as beloved and essential working animals tied to farming life, were especially off-limits. So, for well over a millennium, Japanese cattle were never selected for flavor, or tenderness, or fat. Nobody was asking whether they tasted good, because nobody was eating them. They were bred for one single quality: the ability to work long, brutal hours across steep, difficult ground. And that one requirement, accidentally created the most luxurious meat in the world. Here's how. When you breed an animal for endurance and sustained heavy labor in cold, mountainous terrain, that animal needs energy reserves, deep, accessible fuel it can burn through a long day of hauling and plowing. So, over centuries of selective breeding for stamina, these cattle developed something unusual. They began storing fat not just around their bodies, but woven directly inside their muscles. Intramuscular fat, threaded through the meat like a web. The Japanese have a word for it, shimofuri, which translates to something like fallen frost. That delicate snowflake pattern of white fat laced through red muscle. The farmers weren't trying to make the meat taste better. They were breeding a better worker. The marbling was a byproduct, an invisible consequence of the labor these animals were built to perform. For over 1,000 years, the most prized quality in modern beef was quietly developing inside animals that no one was allowed to eat. The isolation helped too. Japan spent centuries as a closed country, and its mountainous geography meant herds were separated from one another, farm by farm, valley by valley. Breeders often used inbreeding within small local populations, which locked in these traits and kept the bloodlines pure. Different regions developed their own distinct lineages, sealed off from the outside world. The stage was set. Japan had, without realizing it, spent 1,000 years engineering the perfect beef. All it needed was permission to eat it. That permission came from the top. And it came suddenly. In 1868, everything changed. Japan underwent the Meiji Restoration, a massive political upheaval that ended centuries of isolation and threw the country into rapid modernization. The new government wanted to catch up with the Western powers, and that meant adopting Western customs, including Western food. And then came the moment that broke the taboo. In 1872, the Emperor Meiji himself publicly ate beef. For a nation that had banned meat for over 1,000 years on religious grounds, this was seismic. The emperor, considered a near-divine figure, sitting down and eating the flesh of a cow, was a signal to the entire country that the old rules were gone. Beef consumption didn't just rise. According to some accounts, it exploded 13-fold. Almost overnight, a food that had been forbidden for 12 centuries became a symbol of modern, sophisticated, westernized Japan. Suddenly, everyone wanted beef, and Japan looked at its native cattle, those 1,000-year-old working animals with the strange fat woven through their muscle, and realized what it had. But at first, the government thought its cattle were the problem, not the treasure. Wanting bigger animals and more milk, Japanese officials began importing foreign breeds: Brown Swiss, Devon, Shorthorn, Simmental and others, and crossbreeding them with the native stock. Around 2,600 foreign cattle were brought in over about a decade, mixed into the Japanese herds to make them larger and more productive. Then they noticed a problem. The crossbred animals were worse at working, and around 1910, the government reversed course completely. They shut the borders to further genetic importation and began developing the bloodlines in isolation, prefecture by prefecture. Each region refined its own strain: Tajima, Shimane, Kadaka, and others, in careful closed breeding programs. This is the era that created Wagyu as we know it. Freed from the need to breed working animals, farmers finally turned their attention to the meat itself, and specifically to maximizing that beautiful marbling. The trait that had been an accident of labor became the entire goal. By the mid-20th century, these regional bloodlines had produced beef unlike anything else on the planet: Kobe, Matsusaka, Omi, names that would eventually become synonymous with luxury. The meat was so densely marbled it looked pink and white rather than red, some of it carrying 5 times the fat marbling of a top-grade American steak. And Japan realized it was sitting on something extraordinary. So it did what you do with treasure. It locked the vault. For most of the 20th century, Wagyu stayed inside Japan, but between 1976 and 1997, a small window cracked open. A handful of live Wagyu cattle, only around 221 animals in total, were legally exported, most of them to the United States. 4 bulls first, then later a small number of females, enough to start breeding full-blood Wagyu on American soil. That tiny trickle of genetics is the foundation of nearly every Wagyu animal outside Japan today. Just a couple hundred cattle. From that, entire industries in America, Australia, and Canada were born. Then, in 1997, Japan slammed the door. The government officially declared Wagyu a national treasure and banned all further exports of live cattle and genetic material. No more animals, no more embryos, no more semen. The bloodline was now, legally, a protected national asset, treated the same way a country might treat a priceless work of art. But a ban that valuable creates a black market. Wagyu genetics became something worth smuggling. In one case, 2 men were arrested for attempting to smuggle Wagyu semen and embryos out of Japan and into China. The country now treats its cattle DNA as intellectual property, living trade secrets to be guarded by law. Japan had spent 1,000 years accidentally building the world's best beef, and it was not about to let anyone else copy it. Which brings us to the price. Why does Wagyu cost what it does? Part of it is the grading. Japan uses a strict system that scores beef on yield and quality, with the very top tier labelled A5, the highest possible grade, awarded only to beef with near-perfect marbling, colour and texture. Only a small percentage of animals ever reach it. For perspective, the highest American grade, USDA Prime, wouldn't even qualify as A5 on the Japanese scale. It simply doesn't have enough marbling. Then there's the labour. Wagyu cattle are raised slowly and carefully, often for far longer than conventional beef cattle, with meticulous attention to diet and stress. Fewer animals, raised longer, graded harder. That scarcity is built into every step. The result is beef that sells for $200 to $250 a pound at the high end. A single A5 steak on a restaurant menu can cost more than an entire meal for a family. It's served in thin, delicate slices, not because anyone's being stingy, but because the fat content is so rich that a large portion would be overwhelming. Like caviar or truffles, it's not really beef in the everyday sense. It's a different product altogether. So here's the full arc. A small horned cow arrives in Japan 2,000 years ago and spends the next 12 centuries as a living machine, plowing, hauling, forbidden to eat. A religious law ensures nobody ever breeds it for flavour. And in the process of breeding it purely for hard labour, farmers accidentally thread its muscles with the most prized fat in the culinary world. Then an emperor takes a single public bite of beef. 1,000-year taboo shatters overnight, and the nation suddenly discovers that its humble farm animal is secretly a masterpiece. Japan refines it, isolates it, perfects it, and then locks the genetics away as a national treasure, guarded like a state secret. The cow that was once too sacred to eat is now too expensive for most people to afford. And the marbling that makes it worth a fortune? Nobody designed it. It was the fingerprint left behind by 1,000 years of labour, the ghost of every plough that animals' ancestors ever pulled, hidden inside every impossibly tender bite. That's the strange truth about the most expensive steak on earth. It wasn't engineered in a lab or dreamed up by a chef. It was an accident. And it took 1,000 years of hard work to create. If this changed how you look at that impossibly marbled steak, subscribe. There are stranger stories hidden inside the food we take for granted.